Thanks, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Welcome to the first session of our 2021 Tree Trooper training. My name is Gray Brummett. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the restoration technician for the Watershed Stewards Academy. As everyone is joining the session, please just mute yourselves. And then if you could enter into the chat your name, your location in the county, and what is your favorite tree. And if you need assistance in finding that chat, you're just going to scroll your mouse down towards the bottom of the screen, and there should be a chat button, and then a chat box will pop up. So I'm just going to put that prompt into the chat box for everyone to enter that. Awesome. Okay. So we will be recording this session, as Josh mentioned. He's already started and making it available for you all to revisit on your own time. After we finish up with the introductions, Craig and Brittany of the Alliance will be leading a tree and soil biology presentation. Once we wrap up that presentation, Josh is going to take over to show you how to find your Tree Trooper webpage, which is going to be where you can find any and all resources for this class. From there, we're going to wrap up the session with Q&A. So if you have questions throughout any of the presentations, just put those questions into the chat, and we'll create a tally. And then once we get to that Q&A session, we're going to call on you and just ask you to ask your question. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Josh.
Hi, folks. I'm Josh Clark. I'm the restoration coordinator with the WSA. I'm really excited to be here and to see all these faces. And I'm going to turn it over to Craig.
All right. Nice. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen. My name is Craig Highfield. I'm a Forest Program Director at the Alliance of Chesapeake Bay. Let me try that again. And hopefully you all had the opportunity to look at the link that was sent out that kind of covered what we're trying to do with our Tree Stewards training program. So if you haven't, you should probably revisit that. Because it kind of explains it, because tonight we're just going to get really right into the training. So that link probably gave you the background on really why we're hoping volunteers like yourselves will be taking a training like this and being involved in WSA's Tree Trooper program as a way to increase urban tree canopy, which is so vitally important. But so, you know, our training, essentially, we've been offering this in various places in Maryland. So it's trying to emulate kind of a Tree Trooper program in other areas as well. So I'm going to kind of go through it. I do have to mention this is a grant that we have with the U.S. Forest Service in partnership with Maryland Forest Service and Delaware Forest Service. And, you know, all of this outreach we're doing with partners like WSA. We've worked with Anacostia's WSA as well, Anacostia Watershed Societies, and the Antietam-Conococheague Watershed Alliance. So they're all hopefully kind of building similar type programs. So this is really the first session that we have. Kind of, you know, by the end of this, hopefully you'll be kind of tree planting, tree care experts that we need out there kind of leading these efforts. So today we're going to talk about tree and soil biology, and I'm going to admit we're going to go pretty deep in there. Yeah, I would definitely be going into the weeds. The rest of the time, the next week's session will be led by Brittany Haas, who also works with the Alliance. And we'll be talking about site assessment and tree selection. So really how to look at your site and match the right tree for that. We'll then go into tree planting and tree care practices. So proper planting, how to do that, and then how to care for a tree to get them established over the years. The next section of that will be developing planting plans and organizing planting events, and then accessing resources that are available to help you further that along. And then hopefully, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure Josh and Gray will talk about, we'll have a kind of a hands-on tree planting, tree care event. So kind of put everything kind of into a hands-on thing so we can learn from that. But to kind of start it, we'll go into how trees work. So I'm actually going to turn my video off because I don't like seeing myself. So a lot of this material that we're going to cover on how trees work, I think is vitally important because anyone can plant trees. Not everyone does it well, but kind of understanding how a tree is adapted to environment, how it gets what it needs to grow and survive. You could have trees like that. So obviously this Y oak got what it needed. It's a magnificent tree. It was a magnificent tree, but we're going to talk about how something like this, an organism, can get to be that big. Hold on a second. Okay, so what is a tree, first of all? A tree, how it's defined, it's a long-lived perennial. So trees last a long time. They have woody tissue as compared to other type of plants. So they're putting on secondary growth. So they have primary growth and secondary growth. We'll get into defining what that means. And the last thing that kind of separates trees from other types of plants is it's a compartmentalizing organism. And we're going to talk about that as well. So like when you're pruning, what happens after a pruning cut, how a tree responds to that. It can compartmentalize that stuff, but we're going to get all into that. So types of trees. Well, we have essentially angiosperms and gymnosperms. So they're broken down into kind of two groups. An angiosperm is simply just a flowering tree. Often you can see a flower from, let's say, cherry trees. And it's deciduous, meaning most of the angiosperm trees are deciduous, meaning they'll drop their leaves altogether in autumn. Okay, it's deciduous. So there'd be things like oaks, maples, cherries, anything that's hardwoods, broadleaf trees. Those are angiosperms. They actually form their fruit, their seed within a fruit, kind of within an ovary. The opposite, or not the opposite, the other type of tree is the gymnosperms. So they're usually coniferous, meaning they don't produce their seed in an ovary. They produce a naked seed, and there'll be things like pines and spruces and firs. They're going to produce a cone. You've heard them probably called evergreen tree, needle trees, or softwood trees. So you can break down trees into two different types of groups. Very similar, but there are some differences in some of the cell structures of those. And we don't really need to go too deep into that. But then you always have those trees that are going to buck the system, because the bald cypress there on the left is a gymnosperm. It's a conifer, but every year, those leaves kind of turn the yellow into the brown, and then they drop them. So they lose their leaves, which is really that entire section. It's almost like a compound leaf. They'll drop those every year and grow new leaves. But then you have their angiosperm, this American holly, and they keep their leaves throughout the year. So they'll drop them throughout the year, but not anything noticeable. So they'll keep their leaves all through the winter. They can photosynthesize in the winter. But there's some trees out there that kind of buck the system. So how trees grow and develop? Well, just like anything, any organism, it's the use of a release of hormones that work in concert with the environment. So, we, in our glands, we produce hormones in animals. So it's controlling our growth and how we grow. In plants, these hormones are produced in the cells, and they work in concert with the environment, whatever these environmental triggers are that are going to signal the tree to do certain things. Okay, this is kind of important to know. There's various hormones working in concert or against each other within the tree, but they affect things like bud break. So when those trees right now are breaking their bud, that's hormones produced within the tree that are triggered by that, longer light, more rain, warmer temperatures. It's signaling a hormone to cause the buds to break. Leaf fall, seed germination, flowering, ripening of fruit, all those different things are affected by the environment. They're triggered by the environment, but it all has to do with plant hormones. For instance, I just took a picture of this morning of a little seedling of a tulip poplar that I had. Well, it has been warm enough, and this tulip poplar sitting in a small container, that the hormone gibberellins within there, it's triggered by, the longer day temperatures and the heat and the water, that it's now signaling to the buds to start breaking open, allowing that tree, it's safe enough for that tree to start to grow, to put out its leaves, put on new stems. But different in the fall, the auxins, which control a lot of other things, but auxins are what causes our deciduous leaves to fall. So as the days get shorter, it gets drier, gets colder, auxins are produced in that tree, which causes the abscission of our leaves. So essentially the vessels in there close up and the leaf will fall off. So there's a lot of hormones that are backed by those environmental triggers. Well, those hormones also affect how a tree grows in that environment. So here are two trees. They're both white oak, Quercus alba. Okay, but you can see they look drastically different. And the reason they're growing drastically different is they're growing in two different areas. The tree on the left is growing in wide open spaces. So it doesn't really need to grow tall. The hormones within there are causing the tree not to grow tall, but to grow outward. You can see its canopy or its crown right there, very big. It can beat it. It's taking advantage of all that sunlight to produce its food. Now the tree on the right, that's growing in a forest where light is not plentiful. It's actually a competition for light. So those environmental triggers are causing that tree to grow straight up to try to get to the canopy of that forest in order to spread out to make food. So depending where it's growing is how that tree is going to react. So if you're planting in these open suburban areas, you know, your trees are not necessarily going to go up to be really tall. It doesn't need to unless there's competition that's going to force that tree to grow up. And then you have this. I don't know if you've ever been walking in a forest and you happen to see a tree like this. And that's kind of confusing as well, because there's all these branches like it's growing out. So this is what we call a wolf tree. It's a great wildlife tree, but it's a tree that was grown in an open field, probably a farm field. You can see all these side branches because that's what the environment really triggered it to do, is to grow out like that. But essentially a forest has grown in that farm field, grew up around that tree. And a lot of those side branches couldn't make enough. They were getting shaded out, couldn't make photosynthate, and the branches died. So you have some of these wild trees that are growing out there. And you can know walking out there, well, that used to be a farm field where that tree was growing. Okay, so tree, they grow in certain areas, okay? They grow in the meristem. So a meristem essentially is an undifferentiated cell that produces differentiated cells. So cells that become leaves, cells that become flowers and roots and bark, that's all produced in the meristems, okay? We'll get into each one of those. I don't want to be too confusing about it, but there's different areas where the tree is going to take on this growth. And that's just where the meristems are producing these new cells. So one is the apical meristem. And these are at the end of your bud or end of your twig. So at the end of the stems, and that's where primary growth happens. We're going to go into each of those. You also have secondary growth, which is in the stem of that cell. So when a tree is adding wood, when a stem's getting wider, and when it's putting on lateral growth, that's occurring on these meristems. And then you also have cork cambium, which is also within your bark that's producing new bark. So that's where the trees are starting to put on, they're elongating and they're getting wider at their meristems. We're going to break this down. First, primary growth. So right now, that's what your trees are doing right now. The buds are breaking, but it's getting ready to elongate. All those stems are elongating. The roots already have been, because the soil started to warm up. They're elongating under the soil right now. That's the primary growth. You can look closely at these stems right now. And I guess you can see my cursor, right? Craig, can you see my cursor moving? So on those stems right there, you have the meristems, which is producing everything that tree is going to need to elongate. So it's going to be that stem tissue, the leaves, the flowers, everything's getting ready to be produced in there. They're using last year's photosynthate. So it's carbohydrates that are stored. And they have this energy and they're going to take off through this hormonal growth right here. This is called the buds right here. You have lateral buds, and then you have a primary bud right here. The most important thing, the primary bud controls the entire stem. It's going to let these guys know when they can grow or if they're going to grow. So this leader right here controls that whole thing. In a tree that you plant, you may have one leader controlling the whole tree, letting you know when it's going to grow. And that's important. And it does that through a hormone. It controls the growth of the rest of that tree. So let's kind of break it down. So I'm going to give you this as a homework assignment to examine that. But if you had to look at that primary growth, just looking at a stem of a tree, you have that terminal bud here. It controls the growth of the rest of these lateral buds. It's letting them know they're going second. This one's going to grow first to be longer. So these branches are going to get longer. You have your lateral buds. The node is just where that meristem cells are. So they're right here, right here. You can see, and this is kind of interesting. If you go out, within the next week, you're going to look at a stem. I want you to pull or look at a tree and look at the stem of it. You can actually see what is called a girdle scar. So this is where the meristems were last year. This is where that terminal bud was last year. It leaves a little bit of a scar there as it elongates. So all this is what would have grown last year. And you can see this, a lot of times it'll be different colors. If you look at like red maple or even a silver maple, they're very distinguished right now that it'll be a different color. This is new growth that you can see. Also in that old growth, you will actually have buds that never grew. It was controlled by that terminal bud saying, don't grow, it's still there. And I'll show you some pictures of this in a second. So if you look at those buds right there, this is great. This is 3 different types of ash tree, white ash, black ash, and green ash. But you can kind of see this is that terminal bud. It has everything it needs to do to grow. It has that stem tissue, stuff for the leaves, flowers. It's ready to go. It's all packed in that little bundle around these bud scales. They're getting ready to fall off and it's going to elongate. But you can kind of look on that bud too. This is the lateral buds right here. So these guys will grow out and be new branches eventually. This is where last year's leaf was. So these are leaf scars. Usually on the leaf scar is where you're going to have your lateral bud. So it's going to produce new stem with new leaves. But if you look close, you can kind of see last year's where they were. You can see where it was connected to the tree, all these little dots right here. It's how it was connected to the rest of the tree, the leaf transporting its sugars throughout. So just to emphasize, these leaders right here are in control of the growth of the rest of that stem. And I'll let you know why that's important here in a second. So sometimes you'll have trees where that one leader exerts control of that whole tree. And what ends up happening is that tree, looks very straight, has a very long noticeable stem. Things like this, this is a tulip poplar. They have what is called apical dominance. Don't worry about that. Just know that that leader controls the growth of that tree pretty well. Most of your conifers, that's why if you look at a pine tree or a spruce tree, hemlock, they'll have nice straight trunks because that leader is in control of how these branches grow. A lot of other deciduous trees, they have that control for a little bit. Eventually that control kind of wears off. And then you have branches just growing everywhere. And you can kind of see that. You see a nice straight stem, then all of a sudden the lateral branches just take over. You can't tell who the leader is anymore. And so why that's kind of important. So all trees, when they start growing, are going to have that dominant leader that controls it. And if you think about it, trees adapted to grow in a forest, among other trees. So it needed to have one tree or one leader in control so it could grow taller and taller, faster and faster to outcompete the neighbors. So it needed to do that to control the lateral growth. Because if a tree is growing this way, it's taking energy away from being taller because it has to distribute all its carbohydrates to other branches. So this is a black gum sitting outside my house. But you can see, that strong leader's up here. But if you look a little closer on that, there's the leader right here. Something happened to it. Okay, I don't know what, it died. But if that leader dies, what ends up happening are the lateral branches are going to start to grow up. They're going to kind of take advantage of that because they're not under control of the leader anymore. And they're going to try to establish dominance. So they'll start to grow up and one could resume control of the tree, or it could be things like this. So when you start to see trees like that, And this is a silver maple outside of my house. At one point, the leader died, and these were lateral branches that turned upwards, and they never established who was going to be the winner of that tree. So a lot of times you'll see trees like a river birch is notorious for that. They'll have multi stems, and that's just because no leader was really in control. This is great. It looks like a nice tree, but this can be corrected earlier when you plant trees. And we'll talk about that when we get into the tree care thing. Sometimes you can decide who's going to be the leader, especially as trees are growing, so you can avoid low branches in an area where there might be traffic, people walking, stuff like that. You can kind of shape the tree by establishing who the leader is. So this one was really never established who the leader was. It could create a weak point, actually, right at the crotch between those two. But so that's, a lot of times you don't want two stems on a tree. A lot of times when trees get stressed, remember I was talking about those dormant buds. Well, when a tree gets stressed, the leaders can lose control, and then you'll have those buds just awaken, and they'll put these random branches out because they're now going to get control. I mean, they're no longer controlled, so they're now growing. Yeah, so this is called an epicormic shoot. A lot of times, like in a forest, if the outer trees are cut or lost and sunlight hits these new trees or hits these interior trees that never had sun on their bark before or on their stems before, it could cause epicormic shoots. A lot of trees that are distressed, if you see a tree that has a lot of epicormic shoots on it, that tree is distressed, meaning it's putting out, lost control, it's putting out as much stems as they can to capture more photosynthesize, essentially. Trees can do this. Well, when you cut them down, this is especially true in hardwood trees. There's very few conifers that can do this, except maybe pitch pine, is they stump sprout. So cutting down a tree doesn't kill it because it has a root system. The root system's well established on a lot of trees. And what will end up happening is you'll have dormant buds start to grow. So this tree, it's a green ash. It had been attacked by emerald ash borer, killed everything on the surface. And then at the stump, you have dormant buds awakening. That's why if you've ever heard of the story of the American chestnut, well, that blight happened in the 1900s, but you could still walk out in the forest now and see young American chestnut trees growing in our forest. They don't get very big and they don't last very long, but all of that's coming out of the rootstock. It grows certain high, tree dies, hits the blight after 16 years or so, more buds come out of that root system. So they're kind of persisting, very small. Eventually they won't when they run out of their sugars. But I took this today. I was actually out in the woods today. And look at this. This is a tulip poplar. Got blown over. Tulip poplars are notorious for very shallow roots. So they blow over fairly easy, especially in wetter soils. But look at this. So this blew over. The tree's still living because the roots are connected. But these dormant buds, this is a new tree kind of growing out of this. It's just a branch that grew out of this bud that was here. And that's all the way up that tree. So you have kind of this new branch taking off because the leader's dead. The crown is dead over here. So we're done with primary growth. That's just the elongation of stems. And the things to remember is the terminal bud controls the lateral bud growth to a degree, depending on the species. But that's what I hope you get out of that one. All right, now we're going to talk about secondary growth. So this is what makes tree a tree, is having that secondary growth. You're adding the wood on that tree as the tree grows. So it's going to elongate, and then it's going to grow laterally. And that's only if there's enough food. Some years, there's not much lateral growth. Some years, there's a lot. So secondary growth is that. So it happens, you may have heard the terms phloem and xylem. So what that is just that meristem that I had talked about. It's called cambium. And what that's going to do, it's going to produce layers of cells called phloem on the outside between the bark and the cambium. And we'll talk about what that does. And then on the inside, it's going to produce xylem. And that's essentially going to be the wood of the tree. So every year it's going to produce new phloem and new xylem, but that's that meristems that are going to produce that right under the bark. You're going to find that. In here, it's just dead cells. The living part of a tree on that outside is just under the bark. So here's kind of a tree cookie to kind of show you that. You can see you have a typical tree. Turn that tree up, you have your xylem, you'll have a cambium layer, very thin amount of cells, and then you'll have your phloem, and then you'll have your bark. So xylem, what is it good for? Well, it serves many purposes. One of it conducts water and minerals up the tree. So essentially, in the first few layers of your wood is the area where you're going to have water being transported up into that tree. So if you can think about all the cells within it, if you look at a piece of wood, well, there's certain cells that are like straws that go all the way up to the top of the tree to where the leaves are, and then all the way down to the roots. So the roots have this xylem as well. It's that secondary growth. So that's how water is taken from the ground through the roots and all the way up to the leaves where it leaves the leaves. Most of the water in a tree that a tree takes in, they're taking in because they need the minerals from the soil. They need the nutrients. They need that to go to the leaves to be able to make their carbohydrates. Xylem also supports the weight of the tree. So that's the wood. It's just getting bigger and bigger to be able to support the elongation of that tree. It's going to add support through the branches, through the roots. They all have that xylem that's needed. It stores carbohydrates. So if you think about it now, the trees are already growing right now, but there's no leaves. So it needs to, by midsummer, a tree is ready. They're taking their food from their leaves and they're starting to take it down to the roots. They store it in the xylem. So right now the carbohydrates are coming out of the xylem and then up to the stems right now, up to the buds, so they're going to help with growth. And that's why when you're tapping maple trees, you can do that anytime, but that's just the reserves of the tree that were, in the colder months. So it's that carbohydrates moving back and forth from the xylem. And the last thing it does, it helps protect the tree from disease and decay. And I'll show you a couple pictures to show how it does that. So first thing is that water. It's that transportation system. So starting in the roots, it's going to come in through the roots and it's going to go up through the first few layers of the xylem. It's not going to be deep in the tree. Deep in the tree, it's not transporting water. So it's going to travel all the way up to the leaves and then all the way back down through just a few layers of that xylem. So some people call it sapwood, but it's transporting water. And so you can really see this on, this is a black walnut tree, and this is very distinctive, but you can see this is the xylem and this is the xylem. The cambium will be right here. So this area is what's actually transporting water. Okay, it has kind of like those straws, these cells that kind of act like straws to transport water up. This is called, have you ever heard of heartwood? So essentially, these are any living cell that was in here is now dead. And what a tree does is stores a bunch of materials, metabolic waste in here, which kind of gives it that cool color of a black walnut. But these are just dead cells, but it's very, very hard. It's very strong. And that's what gives the support to the trees. So it's transporting water and it's giving support. So this is cool too. I love looking at these things. These things are called tree cookies. And you can kind of see how a tree is giving that support to the weight. So this is the center of the tree. When you planted it, this was it right here. This is where that main stem was. It's called, the area is the pith. But you can see over the years where the wood was added. So just looking at this, I can surmise that this side of the tree, the left side of the tree, there were probably very few branches, maybe because it was shaded over on that side. But you look on that right-hand side, maybe that was facing the sun where there were more branches, the branches were growing towards, so it was more material over here. So what a tree can do is put wood where it wants it. So it's called reaction wood. So as the tree starts to lean, it's going to start to add wood there to kind of support the weight of that. And you can kind of see that through the rings. It's going to do one annual ring, but it's going to add a lot more to this side because maybe there was a lean to that. So that's why the trees are supporting itself. It's amazing architecture when you kind of look at how a tree is structured. Now, Look at this. This is an old white oak tree. But you can see a lot of those old trees, especially in shallow soiled area, it's going to start to buttress itself. So a tree, when people say, you know, it's like a cylinder, it's not a cylinder. A tree is a cone, essentially how it grows. You know, the older part's down here, but it's going to be forming a cone to be able to support its weight. So a lot of times if you're walking through a forest and you see trees that are really buttressed out, could be the soil's wet, so the roots aren't very deep, shallow rooted stuff, or they're older trees. They need to buttress out to support the weight of it. They're just adding wood where it needs it. Or even on a branch, if you look at branches, the tree is going to add its wood down here, okay, to support the weight of that branch as it gets bigger. Okay, this is called the root collar. And when we get into pruning, that we'll see why this is really important to have something like this. But you can see it's adding that weight, so adding the wood where it needs to be. So that's why they can survive for so long. The last thing kind of in the xylem are the rays. So these are just living cells. And when I talk about storing carbohydrates, this is for the roots as well. They have rays, they have their xylem. This is where it happens. So it's going to store it in here. So it's transporting stuff. So in the summertime, it's going to start putting carbohydrates down these cells for storage. And then now in the spring, it starts to come out here, back up to the buds that are starting to grow. So those are the rays. But you can see, obviously, this is what's transporting a lot of the water. These are cells that transport the water up and down. So they're kind of like straws all the way up through there. And this is just a great picture of an oak. That last one was an oak too. A nice star pith right there, but you can see the rays. You can see where the water was once conducted. So on oaks, especially white oak, they'll seal these off really well when they're no longer functional. So it's just the outer few rings that are transporting it, but then they seal these off to kind of prevent from rot. That's why you use white oak when people are using wine barrels and bourbon barrels, because they seal themselves very well. All right, let's get into the phloem. The phloem, you know, is very, very important. Less exciting because it's a very tiny layer right here. But this is where the sugars from the leaves are going to be transported down. So the xylem transports the water up. The phloem transports the carbohydrates down to where the tree needs it through the rays. So any of the cells that need that food, it's transported through the phloem. Okay, and that's just that thin layer here. Every year that cambium right there is producing new phloem. The phloem eventually just gets crushed into bark, never gets that thick, not like the xylem. The phloem just becomes bark essentially. But every year it's just a few layers of cell, but it's vitally important. And the problem with that is this thing it's transporting food, it's just right under the bark. So trees can be susceptible if their bark isn't thick or you have things like that. So this again is another ash tree. I'm just picking on that one because it's so devastating to see. But when you think of emerald ash borer, which is the insect that's just wiping out all our ash trees, it's so devastating to trees. It's not the adult, it's the larvae that's devastating. So the adults will put their larvae on the tree, and the larvae, or their eggs, they lay their eggs, and the larvae essentially hatch and they start eating all the phloem and the cambium layers of the tree, which at first, not a bad thing. I mean, it's not terrible for the tree because it can still transport food up and down, but eventually you get enough of these areas where they're deep and there's no more phloem or cambium, essentially girdles the tree. So a tree slowly will start to show signs of distress. The leaves won't be as full, they won't have as many branches, things start to die back. And eventually they just cannot transport food up and down. So the tree essentially starves. Compartmentalization. So that's the last thing that kind of makes a tree, is able to compartmentalize, openings. So this will be especially important when we talk about pruning or corrective pruning. But a tree, it doesn't heal itself. If you cut yourself, your body heals. It forms new materials. Trees don't do that. They'll compartmentalize that injury. Naturally, trees growing in the forest, when you plant them, they might have a lot of branches, but they're growing up. Eventually, branches that can't support themselves. I mean, they can't make enough photosynthesis, they die and they break off, and that's natural. But then what a tree does is they'll grow wood around that injury. And you may never notice. If you look up on trees in a forest, a very, very tall, you'll never notice that there were branches there at one point because they've fallen off and the tree grows over them. So you can see this branch right here, or what was it? I mean, that's new bark over it. There's new wood, new bark over it. This injury on this urban tree, you can see the wood is starting to grow back over it. Eventually, it'll combine and this stuff will be on the interior. So you can look again at this oak tree. So I don't know, a decade ago, there was an injury on that tree. It doesn't produce new cells in here. This is still rot. So there was rot going on. What a tree will do is the rays will be reinforced here to prevent the rot from going this way temporarily. New wood comes across here, which prevents rot from continuing around this way. And then these cells, because there's all that sap and metabolic waste in there, will prevent the rot from coming this way. So this is a temporary kind of fix. But you may have heard of heartwood rot, or you might see a tree that eventually falls down that was doing fine and it's hollow in the middle. And eventually rot will kind of take over. But a tree, remember, the living cells on it that are right out here. So this is just dead wood. But trees have a way to compartmentalize. So just to take away from kind of secondary growth, it's, you have xylem produced on the inside, phloem on the outside by cambium. Xylem transports water and minerals, that's the important thing, from our soils, and it provides support through wood. Phloem transports carbohydrates. So when you're when you do tap a tree for maple sugar, it's that phloem you're coming into that's going to give you that syrup. And then trees can compartmentalize injury. It's a lot of information so far, but I hope everyone's hanging on this. We can take questions whenever. I mean, if there's a time you want to break, or I could just answer them at the end too, but if anything comes up. Bark is cool. Bark is great. So think about your best jacket you might have. Think of a jacket that can moderate your temperature in the summertime when it's 110 degrees out, or 15 degrees out. I mean, that's what bark does. So it moderates the internal temperature of a tree. It reduces the waters being lost, protects against injury, and it enables gas exchange. So this is really important because as the tree's growing, just like you and I, when we're breathing, we're breathing in oxygen and out carbon dioxide. We kind of need those there. And that's what the tree allows us to do through these things called lenticels. So you can see on this tree, very noticeable. This is where this is where carbon dioxide is coming out and oxygen's going in. And so that tree can grow. So that's where it's breathing. But all trees, when they start, they have very smooth bark. Okay, any tree that you have. So these little trees, very smooth bark, but eventually, that tree gets a little bit wider, that lateral growth, and the bark grows with it. So it's nice and smooth. But eventually, when the tree is growing so much laterally, the bark can't keep up with it, especially the older bark. And what starts happening, there's fractures and fissures. And then you start to have bark that looks like this. Remarkably, looking at these two trees, they're the same tree. This is a black cherry tree. Start out like that, but eventually it's going to look like that when it's older. And this is cool. And we use this for tree ID, but there are fibers that hold the bark on, and how the fibers arranged, it gives you different appearances of bark. Okay, so you have these little flaky stuff like a cherry, or you might have long strips on a maple. So it's really cool. You can start to ID trees by the bark it forms, which is kind of cool. And so within that bark, remember, there is a cambium layer that's producing, it's producing corky tissue. The phloem becomes part of that. So the new bark is being formed every year as well through a meristem. It's cambium. The leaves, so the vital leaves of a tree. I think we all know the purpose of the leaves, but they could look different. This is a hemlock. So needles essentially are the leaves of the tree. They just help better with desiccation. You have broadleaf leaves like this. But obviously they're for photosynthesis. This is where the tree makes its food. So the more leaves they have, the more food they can make. So this is why I always have a trouble with people over pruning trees, because that's how a tree is going to survive, especially as it gets bigger and bigger. When we over prune trees, we reduce the amount of food the tree can make for itself to be able to grow. So a lot of this does happen. A lot of times topping trees, that happens. It takes a long time for new buds to come and new leaves to be formed. And you have a lot of material that needs to be maintained. So through photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, through photosynthesis, you're going to get that sugars and oxygen, and then they use that to metabolize their growth. This is kind of a cool thing with leaves. So leaves are a little bit different. This is both probably on the same tree. This is a white oak, but trees have different types of leaves. So you have leaves that are kind of on the top of the tree that get the most sunlight. These are called your sun leaves. Cool thing about sun leaves, though, right at the base of that rachis, or the stem of that leaf, it can turn. So as the sun kind of goes over the tree, right at the end, the tree can actually turn its leaf. This is mainly on the broadleaves where it can do it. It can turn its leaf to kind of follow the sun, to kind of maximize that surface to the sun, because the more the sunlight's hitting there, the more food it can make. This is a shade leaf. So if you think about in a tree, especially a big tree, there's a lot of leaves that are getting shaded. So they'll be different. They'll often be broader. Like on a red oak, they'll be huge compared to the sun leaves, which will be tiny. In what they are, they're very thin. A sun leaf will be very, very thick because it's preventing desiccation, or that leaf from drying up. But the shade leaf will be very thin, very broad, because it's trying to capture any flecks of sun beneath the other leaves in order to grow and make that photosynthesis, the carbohydrate. Kind of cool thing about leaves. And then I think the coolest thing about leaves are the stomata. This is the essential part on the underside of the leaves. And this is kind of what controls how water comes up through a tree. There's kind of these little openings, these little mouths they look like, but they're just cells that control the opening and closing of these stomatas. When they open, water vapor comes out into the atmosphere. And what happens, it causes water to come in from the roots. So they open, that water leaves, through capillary action, is pulling water up through those straws to the leaves. When they close, that's not happening. So any days that are really hot and dry, those stomatas might stay really closed to prevent the tree from losing water. It just helps the tree protect itself. It's not photosynthesizing because it doesn't have water, but they stay closed. So on good days where it's not so dry, they'll open, water comes up. At night, they usually close because the tree can't photosynthesize. In the day, they generally stay open. But stomatas are underneath the leaves. They're very, very tiny. Now coming into roots, we're working our way around the tree. So roots are funny because people have perceptions of roots. Now you probably heard a lot, roots are as much down into the ground or they are above the ground. And, oftentimes you see pictures of roots like that. And, here's a typical drawing of a tree, but that couldn't be further from the truth on how a tree actually grows. Most of the roots of a tree are going to be in the top 3 feet of soil. Okay. They grow laterally. There's really no reason for them to grow down into the soil. All the water that they're trying to get is going to be up here, unless they're can try to go down to the water table, which these seeker roots here are doing. There's no reason to be there. Everything they need in the surfaces. This is where the best soil is. This is where they can get the water first. So they tend to spread out. Most of your roots are going to be in that top 3 feet of soil. The functions of the root, well, it anchors the tree so it doesn't fall down. So growing laterally helps that. It's storage, so it stores those carbohydrates again in the wintertime, so it can use and grow into the spring. It's absorption, so it absorbs the water. That's how a tree gets its water. It's through its roots, and it conducts it. So it conducts it from the roots connects it to the stem, up there. So there is that connection there. Now roots, they need water and air for optimal growth. What I mean, a lot of people think, well, it's soil, it's down there. They need oxygen. If they don't have oxygen, they cannot survive. So if you think about a compacted soil, there's probably not a lot of oxygen down there. In mucky, swamps, there's very few trees that can survive. And the ones that do have adaptations to be able to get oxygen to the roots. So if you think about a bald cypress, there's no oxygen in that mucky soil. So they need to get that down. That's why I have those knees up there. But they also need water as well. So that's what they're searching for. That's what causes them to grow out. So a lot of times I think tree planters, we tend to overwater trees, watering them every day. And what that does is it keeps the roots all together rather than have those roots searching in the soil, spreading out to find that water. So looking at that again, so if you think, the roots behave a lot like, what the branches produce. They have their elongation. They have their primary growth. Instead of a bud, they sort of have a cap on the end of the roots that controls the rest of the roots, just like we talked about with the stems. This is another misperception is the taproot. All trees are going to start off with a taproot. That's what anchors that tree initially. It's kind of that deep root. But most trees lose that after a few years. There's no need for them to have it. A few trees like hickory can probably maintain it longer, and they might have a longer taproot. But most of the time, it just doesn't grow anymore. It hits too constrictive part of the soil, or it's girdled by the other trees. So the other roots just sort of choke it out. So most trees the most mature trees don't have a taproot. It's all lateral roots growing out. But kind of the same thing. So, looking at the root, you have that apical meristem that's dominated everything. It has those caps, just like a stem, that every year kind of open as the trees grow out, actually along pressure gradients to find that water, it elongates. And they also have these root hairs. So these roots have hairs, and this is how the water actually gets in. This is for anchorage and storage. But the root hairs are for water. That's how the water and minerals get into the tree. So this is a great picture. This is an awesome picture of a root. You can see kind of that root cap there. That'll come off and the roots keep moving out that way. And then those root hairs are what take in the water. This is probably the coolest thing that I think research on this has just really come a long way, and it's affecting the way we're starting to plant trees as well. Is most trees have a symbiotic relationship with a fungus. It's called mycorrhizae fungi, and they attach themselves to the roots of the tree. So most of the time you think of a fungus attacking a tree or being part of a tree as a bad thing. And there's definitely some parasitic fungi out there where it's not a good thing to have that. But the growth of trees, probably it's essential to have these fungus in the soil and attached to the root, because what it does is increases the amount of space or surface area on these roots to take in more water. So a tree is able to take in more water and minerals through this relationship. So this fungus is attached to these roots, which increases the amount of water that can go in. What the fungus gets is just a little bit of sugar, throw me some sugar this way. So they can feed on it that way. There's evidence that, this fungus can attach to the same fungus on another tree and help actually transport water or minerals from one tree to the other. So they are connected on that. Every species we have out there has an assigned fungus to them. There's different species of that. So a lot of times we're thinking, well, if we're planting in an agricultural field that's been an agricultural field for 150 years, a lot of times it's not going to have that fungus any longer in the soil. Eventually it'll get it, but a lot of times we're thinking, is there ways to inoculate some of the soil? So these trees, or just inoculate the stock so they can have this fungus, because this is essential for maximum growth of your trees. And the last thing I'll talk about with the trees is something that a lot of people forget is trees respire. So they make their food, but like you and us, they have to consume their food. And when they do that, they produce carbon dioxide. So when they're respiring, just like us, we're respiring and producing that. So trees are a great sink for carbon dioxide. You know, they'll be essential for climate change, but at the same time, they are releasing carbon dioxide as well. They just take in more carbon than release. So, and that's important to know. So they need oxygen and they need carbon dioxide. So they need them both to carry on. Okay, I'm going to go into soils, but maybe we'll pause there to see if there is any questions, because I've been talking a lot.
We have a good amount of questions already. So first, I saw a couple of questions come in from Allison. Allison, if you wanted to unmute and ask your questions.
So let me go back and see what I asked. Let's see. Oh, so a lot of times people will cut trees down and then they'll say, look, the tree was dead, it was hollow. But I've heard both sides, that it wasn't actually dead. So is every tree that has hollowness to it, it's still, you know, how much life can it live with a hollow?
Well, yeah, I mean, it could live for, I mean, when a tree is hollow, all it is, it affects the structure of the tree. So it can live as long as, you know, it just doesn't fall down. Eventually it's going to be so weakened that it might cave down or fall down. But remember, the living portion of that tree, the living cells are on the outer ring. So the thing that's rotting inside that cell is the heartwood. It's just dead cells anyway. So it could be compromised eventually, but it's still going to be living.
So that's a natural process.
Yeah, absolutely. Heartwood has always occurred.
Right. And so, and then you showed the stump with the tree growing back. I see this with catalpas.
Yep.
Right. So if you cut the catalpa down to the ground, which a lot of people do because they reseed, they're very prolific, then they start growing back. That's going to grow back to an entirely big tree again.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of times if you have a timber harvest, especially on hardwood stands, no one's planting trees there again. The trees just grow back from the stump sprout. So a lot of times forests are relying on what's growing on the stump sprout. And often the stump sprout will grow much faster than any tree you plant because it already has this established root system. It doesn't have to form roots, it has it. And so you'll see growth on a tree that's been cut. Now, the thing is, you know, if the stump's high and it's putting out a root or it's putting out a stem high, eventually the bottom rots out and the tree will fall down. So as long as it starts low, you know, that'll turn into another tree. And that's why when they harvest, they cut the trees really low so they can get that regrowth.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm not sure this person's name, S. Fox, had a couple of questions. S. Fox, if you want to unmute and ask your questions.
Sure. So I guess two. One, trees that are being wrapped up with vines, right? Can they truly kill the tree, seeing how the xylem and the phloem are so close to the outside of the tree?
Yeah. Yeah, there's several things that vines do, and some vines are natural on trees, but you know, we have a lot of invasive vines. So the problem with vines is they add extra weight. Trees are great at supporting their own weight. A lot of times when there's a lot of vines on the tree, that's fine. The tree can support the weight, but then when you add wind twisting and then you add you know, snow on top of that, that's just suddenly extra weight on that tree that, I mean, they'll survive. It's not preventing them from photosynthesizing. A lot of those vines, well, sometimes it does, but a lot of the vines do stay close to the stem. It's just that added weight can be a big problem on trees.
Sure. And so I guess I'm asking more specifically, can the vines actually wrap around the tree so tightly that it could interrupt that natural flow? Yes.
No, that's a great point too. And a lot of times, especially in younger trees, they can girdle trees. So they can wrap so tightly around them that they're actually preventing the transport of food up and down. So yeah, for sure.
And then the other question I had, thank you, is will a tree compete with itself, or does it actually grow knowing that, hey, if I put a branch here, I don't want to put a branch, is that why we see kind of the staggered growth of branches and leaves? Will it compete with itself?
No, that's another great question. No, trees want to kill each other. They're really only concerned with themselves. And that's true if you look at a farm field that's grown back into a forest or starting to, there'll be thousands and thousands of trees per acre. And their main goal is they help each other grow straight up, but that's purely out of competition. Eventually it's going to be, 100 trees per acre at a mature forest. So yeah, they don't definitely try to benefit each other, as a species, but, that's why forests thin out over a period of time. But, a tree will take advantage if there is an opening between a tree or a tree starts to grow sideways. It's just because it was able to put branches there, and that's how it got bigger and bigger. So yes, they grow funky in order to take advantage of light that happens to be on them.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. And then there was a question from Lisa Bender. Lisa, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Sorry, I'm trying. You couldn't hear me say that. I've always been taught that when you see the leaves turn over, that it was one of the indications of rain or moisture in the air. Is there a certain leaf or a certain type of leaf or a certain tree that is significant of?
That's a good question too. I don't know, actually. I hadn't heard that. They do follow the sun, but yeah, I didn't hear that about rain. I mean, I can see that why they would do the sun, just as they need to keep as much surface to the sun as they can, but that's a good question. I don't know.
I know that, they look silver when they turn.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting. I don't know.
Lisa, I heard back in Ohio, they always told us that when a maple tree's leaves turn over and you can see the underside of them, rain is on its way.
Huh?
That's what I've always been told for years and years.
Yeah.
Me too.
Well, that's good.
Very cool. There was a question about fungi and whether trees communicate with each other, but I know a lot of people commented and referenced Paul Stamets' work, specifically the documentary Fantastic Fungi. If anyone hasn't seen that, I highly recommend it. It's great. Craig, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that at all. I know we're about to go into tree and soil relations.
Yeah, no, just the fungi is essential in our soil, and we'll get into that with the soil, but yeah, that mycorrhizae it's pretty remarkable. I've seen it, and one thing about roots as well, and we'll get into it, but roots of the same species too can graft to each other. So there can be kind of, I just got done saying trees only care about themselves, they'll outcompete each other, but in a mature forest specifically, when grafting has occurred, there can be transport of resources from tree to tree through root grafts or even through mycorrhizae of that same species, but that's how they can communicate too. So yeah, it's really remarkable what's going on under the ground. We're always amazed with the above ground stuff, but underground is pretty fascinating.
It's so cool. There's a couple of other questions. Not sure who of the Novikis asked a question. If you two wanted to unmute and ask your question. Not sure if it was Larry or.
Yes, I had a question about maple trees and shedding of bark chips. I have an older maple in front of the house, and I've noticed in the past couple years, it's literally shedding chips of bark off of the tree. Is that a sign it's under distress or?
Yeah, probably not. I'm assuming it's probably either a red maple or silver maple. probably
Silver, I believe.
silver a lot too. Silver bark, I mean, silver maple bark, it does slough off a lot because it does grow in that strips. Could be something peeling the bark off. I've never really heard of them. I mean, if they're dropping significant amounts of bark, like large chunks of it, then definitely there's dead stem tissue. But if it's just kind of the outer flakes of it, that's natural. I wouldn't be concerned about that. But if it's really large chunks of it, then there's definitely dead stem tissue on it.
Thanks.
Okay. And then the next two questions are kind of related, so I'm just gonna combine them of sorts. The first is just if you make a bad prune, can a tree correct for that, or do you do irreparable harm? And then the other one is related, like if BGE comes and butchers a tree with no notification, should at some point there be some careful pruning to reshape the tree?
Yeah, you definitely, because you can definitely prune a tree too far up a branch. We had that root collar picture. You kind of want to be right at that root collar when you're doing it. Probably the biggest problem is when they prune it too close to the trunk. I'll see if I can get to that picture real quick. Did I go by it? No, I didn't. Good. So yeah, so this is the root collar. When we do get into pruning, you're going to want to prune right here. And there's a set procedure on how to prune because you do not want to rip any of this bark. This is where the growth is going to close the best, right out here. A lot of times when people prune, they think, well, I'm going to prune everything because I don't want a knob on the tree. When you cut this off, you lose a lot of those meristems. That's going to close that wound. It's gone. And a lot of times a tree may never recover from a prune like that. It'll start to close, but it may take forever to do. The rot may exceed in that. So definitely when you're pruning, it's going to be on that root collar out here. It's better to prune out here and then come back and prune closer than to prune this off. So yeah, there's definitely good ways and bad ways to prune. And you can always go back to re-prune, especially if BG&E, if they're cutting out here, that's fine. You could always come back here and prune on that.
Awesome. I think we're good to continue on.
Okay, we'll get into tree and soil relations. So this is probably the most important part of a tree is that root system. It kind of dictates everything that's growing upwards. But that all has to do with your soils as well. It's that interaction. So if you just want to talk about soils, what they're made up of, on this optimum soil, you got 45% of your soil is just the minerals, and that comes from the bedrock or whatever was put there by the river eventually. So you have this minerals, which is gravel, sand, silt, and clay. 5% of it is just organic material, and that's on a good soil, 5%. And then the rest of it is a lot of people don't think about, and this is probably the most crucial part for trees, it's pore space. It's just space in that soil to hold water and air. Okay, like the root system is going to have to release carbon dioxide as it grows, but it needs oxygen. So you need that air space in there, not a big space, but enough for that tree to respire, for the roots too. So when you think about that soil, so this is your typical soil profile, comes in layers. So you have an organic layer on top, and that's just like the first inch or so from debris, and depending what soil you have, how thick that is. You have an A layer, which is a lot of minerals. It's a little bit of mineral soil, a lot of organic material, a lot going on there, a lot of roots there. And then you have the B section, which you have your mineral soils, but that's where a lot of your root activities down in for anchorage. You can see that first 30 inches in a lot of soils. And then you get into the C, where this is just, broken up minerals down here. There's not much going on. There's not organic material down there. It doesn't have a lot of pore space. So you can see just looking on this, why your roots kind of want to stay in this area. That's where all the action is. Okay, they're growing laterally because they get what they need in those top few layers of that soil. So that area, it's self-perpetuating. It's called the rhizosphere. So those roots are down in those first, few feet of soil. But what they're doing, they're growing and they're sloughing off organic material and they're leaking carbohydrates. And what that does is draws flora and fauna. So there's going to be funguses that form in that soil. And there's going to be, nematodes. There's going to be all kind of life that's in that soil, which just adds more to that soil. There's going to be a lot more pore space as things root around there, worms root around there, the roots spread out. So it's the area of the soil where there's the most biological activity is in those first few feet. And it just keeps perpetuating yourself when you have that tree cover in there, in those first layers of soil. So let's talk about those pores and why they're so important. They are those gaps between the soil. We have macropores and micropores. You need them both. The big space tends to hold the air. Okay, so like I said, you have oxygen in there. Eventually that fills up with carbon dioxide as that roots grow. And then we have days like today where it rains, where that water goes in and it flushes that carbon dioxide out, more oxygen comes down in there. So it's how the roots do gas exchange. If you don't want to build up of carbon dioxide. So you kind of need that exchange in there. And then you have micropores. And this is where the water is going to stay. A tree cannot take out minerals. So when it rains in a forest, the tree's not taking anything up until all of that water passes through. It can't take up in a saturated soil. So as it passes through, water remains in your soil and the micropores. And that's where the root hairs are taking in that water. It's in that. When it's raining and they're not taking that water in. And then this is the time where the minerals ionize, so that they're in that solution. So when they're taking that water in, they're taking the minerals in that solution. So your soils, everyone's soil is probably slightly different depending where you are. You have a composition of either sand, silt, or clay, or a combination of all of those. So sandy soils, everybody knows sand. It's very gritty. There's a lot of pore space, a lot of big pores in there. That's why they tend to drain water very quickly. They can be dry. They don't have a lot of organic material. Silt's a little bit smaller particles, could hold more water. Clay is very tight, doesn't drain water very well at all, but it has a lot of mineral content in it. And we'll kind of get in through what a soil could look like. So you're never going to have a soil that's going to be all one thing. It's just going to be a mixture of different things. You have percentages of particles in there. Some of it's going to be clay, some of it's going to be sand, some of it's going to be silt. When it's a combination of all of those, you have what's called a loamy soil. And that's good. You want a loamy soil where there's a mixture because you're getting the best of everything. You want it to drain well, but not too well. You want it to be able to hold ions like in a clay soil, but you don't want it to hold too much water. You don't want to be saturated all the time. So, on your soil, you may have a silty clay, you might have a silty loam, or a sandy clay. So it all has, the trees react to it. There's different trees, and we'll talk about this, I believe next time, when we're matching the trees to your soils on how to do that. You have to find out what trees will do well in a clay soil, what trees will do well in a dry, sandy soil. And you match those to each other. You don't want to put a tree that does really well, in moist soil, like a tulip poplar needs a really perfect loam soil. They grow really fast, but you don't want to put them up on dry, drained soils because they won't survive at all. So they need to have a moist soil. So we'll talk about that next time. So the problem with a lot of urban soils and suburban soils is there's no A or O part of that. There's an organic layer or an A layer. There's very little B in its way. So because it's been manipulated, it's been parked on, constructed, it's manufactured soils. So a lot of times in our areas, we need to try to match those trees that are going to do well in those conditions. So urban soils are tough. They're tough to grow trees in compared to, we do a lot of rural planting, much easier there. Trees last longer. You have compaction. Compaction is the major issue with urban soils or even suburban. I mean, you think of how many people are just, parking on the side of the road, pulling into someone's lawn, urban areas, people standing right next to the trees. Just walk through town and kind of see some of our urban trees and the soil conditions. Because if you think compaction, what's happening here is that pore space. And this is probably the biggest problem, I think, in urban trees is having to deal with compaction. So you have that big pores, small pores. But when you have urban soils and compactions, you're essentially squeezing that pore space out of that soil. And a lot of times if that's happening in the wet, that's why you have ruts and things like that. The soil may never repair itself on its own. So you need to match trees that are going to do well in compaction. So compaction is kind of the biggest problem, because then there's nowhere for air to sit in there because you're taking out all this big pore space. So the soils tend to be saturated when they're compacted. And you can see something like that. So water's going to sit there a lot longer. It's not going to drain very well. You're not going to have that gas exchange that those roots crucially need. And so a lot of times when you're looking at a tree and the tree's dying back, like let's say the leaves are falling off early or different stems are starting to die off, the problem is down in the roots. There's something going on in the soil that's hurting that tree. It's not usually something that's hitting the exterior of the tree on the trunk or in the leaves. Most of the time it's a root issue and a soil issue. So people do ask a lot of times, should I add fertilizers or things to my soil? Should I, spray the trees? And the answer really is no. And we'll get into that probably next week. Brittany will talk about that a little bit. There's probably not much you want to do to try to change the soil. The soil you have is the soil you have. It's best to kind of match the tree. Alkalinity, it's something you can test. There's something you can amend for, and we'll get into that next time. But, while soil alkalinity or acidity is so important, is, most trees do well with a slightly acidic soil, or, it could be slightly basic. I have it on this, kind of a 6.3 to a 7.4. Urban soils tend to be more alkaline. And so the problem with that, because there's a lot more concrete around there, road salts can increase the alkalinity of the soil. When a soil becomes too basic or too acidic, what happens is the minerals in the soil are no longer available to the actual tree because they bind to other things. So don't worry about that. So amending the soil may not help on a soil that's too basic or too acidic. So they're no longer available to it. But there are things you can do to slightly alter the pH that might have a lasting effect, as opposed to fertilizing a tree where it temporarily helps the tree initially, but you got to constantly go back and do it. So soil was really easy. I'm going to wrap it up there. But before I do want, try this week is to go out, look at a tree and see if you can identify the different parts. Because right now they're getting, they're starting to grow. So see if you can pick out the different parts of a tree. Take a close look at the twig. But I will kind of end it there. I know we're going over here, but I'll open it up to any questions you have. And I think Josh was going to do something as well.
Yeah, we can just do a couple of questions, I think, first, if that sounds good, Josh. I saw Allison had another, you want to start us off with your questions?
I wanted to ask, it's a rhetorical question. We have a lot of clay, and a lot of people think if you add sand to clay, then it'll become loam or a viable place to plant a tree. And I just wanted you to talk about that if you could.
It's a good way.
Yeah, I mean, you can make cement that way for sure.
That's exactly what I told the person I talked to this morning.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, adding you have the minerals that you have. You don't want to change that. I mean, it's best to kind of match the tree that's going to do well. So you could take things like a pin oak, for instance, does well, on those hard urban soils. And there's a list of urban trees that do well in those conditions. Sycamores, do well kind of in the urban environment, but you're never going to change it. Anytime people try to change the soil, it's a temporary fix that they constantly have to go back to. You're a landscaper's dream if you're constantly wanting them to come back or to keep fertilizing the soil for their trees. I don't know what you do with lawns, but it's best to start with matching the tree that's going to do well. On that, there's things you can do to help. The problem with clay soils is the lack of pore space. So you're losing the porosity of that soil. but there's things you can do to augment that. You know, mulching, when we get into tree care stuff, mulching is a tremendous thing that you can do. Adding compost is another thing. When you add organic material to that clay soil, it's just, you're creating more pore space. You're allowing for infiltration.
Yeah. Leaf litter is also great.
Mhm.
So, my second question was, what was my second question? Oh, were you going to talk about plants that can, or trees that can actually handle more compaction, or is that going to happen later?
Yeah. So
And
next
actually,
section we'll get into, Brittany will get into site assessment. So looking at going out to the area you want to plant trees and kind of evaluating that, and then being able to take those conditions, because it'll be soil conditions, but it'll also be where it is in the landscape, a whole variety of things that are surrounding it, and how to match the proper tree to that. So that'll do with compacted soils, or even sandy soils that are, you know, they drain a lot and are, you know.
I'm thinking of a schoolyard where there's going to be a lot of children.
Absolutely. Oh no, that's a great point too. Is techniques to, you know, especially in high trafficked areas with kids.
And then every time you plant a tree, should you be going and putting in mycorrhizal fungi?
No, I would say, I mean, you know, I would say no. I mean, they're probably tough to find ones that's going to match that tree. Eventually they will be there. You know, I know in some container stock, they do try to inoculate there where they can. I'd say it's probably not necessary. Hopefully, I mean, if you're planting in an ag field that hasn't seen it in a long time, there could be some benefit. But to be honest, I don't even know where the science is on trying to do that yet.
I had just heard more, it might be something for dogwoods is what
Okay, yeah.
Dogwoods might benefit from that. I didn't know if you had.
I haven't heard that. No, yeah, I haven't heard that.
Okay. Thank you.
And then I saw a question come in next from Mary Borland. Mary, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, this is a pretty simple question, but you know, you're saying that the roots are pretty shallow. So how does the tree keep from the roots from freezing when it's really cold out? Because I know the frost line's like what, 30 inches or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, it's just like the stem as well. They're not growing in that time, but you know, they do have an outer layer. They are going to be frozen. I mean, the ground could be frozen, the root could be frozen in the ground, and it's not necessarily affecting the roots. Now, the root hairs, it for sure will affect. But you know, in adaptation of that tree's producing new root hairs every year. So it actually sloughs that off. Definitely the frozen ground affects those root hairs. It would kill those, but you know, they're growing those back every year because of things like that, which is great because it adds organic material to the soils. But yeah, I mean, there is a problem, you know, there can be issues with, you know, trees, especially if they're sitting in containers outside. If you know, it's frozen for a while on small trees as well, that can be an issue, I would think. But
is that why there's like a tree line on a mountain where that's from the frost line?
No, it's, yeah, usually when you're seeing mountains, when you get up, trees just can't grow up there. The season's not long enough. You know, I mean, the conditions just aren't right for trees to be able to dominate those areas.
Okay.
And then since we're running out of time, I just saw one last question from Bill. Bill asked, do all woody plants grow in the same way?
Woody in the same, well, you know, with the elongation, yeah, with kind of the primary and secondary growth, they're all doing that. How they grow though will be much different. Like when you're thinking of a small, you know, shrub or something, it's obviously growing different because it's adapted. You know, if you're thinking about a forest setting, it's never going to grow tall to try to compete with the trees. It has different adaptations. So it might grow more laterally, you know, its elongation, you know, it's going to leaf up earlier to take advantage. That's why if you look in the forest now, you have all of that green that's kind of emerging on the forest floor. You know, there's shrubs and they're going to put their leaves out earlier to be able to capture the sun, because then they're just going to get shaded. So, you know, they all have different tolerances on how they grow, but the principle on woody plants of primary growth and secondary growth, yeah, it's going to be the same, but every species is different.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Craig.
Yeah.
Amazing. I could listen to all of this biology every day. It's my favorite.
Well, good. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully we won't have to go as deep. That first one's always a slug to get through, but I always look at it. I'm afraid to cut anything out. I want to talk about everything. So.
No, thanks, Craig. And I will say this is a really exciting part of the whole Tree Trooper experience, being able to work with the Alliance and bring to bear your incredible knowledge. I know we covered a lot tonight, folks. As you know, this whole thing has been recorded. I believe we're also sharing a PDF of the presentation. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I will send that to you guys. I was
Perfect.
working on it to the last minute. So.
Excellent. And that's actually a great segue because I'm going to actually show folks, if I can share my screen.
Oh yeah. Let me stop sharing here. I'm sorry.
I'm going to show folks where they can actually find where everything is going to live here for the next little bit. So this should look familiar to most eyes here. This is the aawsa.org, our main website. So if you put that into the bar, and then you go up under programs, go under Replant Anne Arundel, go down to the Tree Trooper program, or you can just put in aawsa.org / Replant Anne Arundel as one word. Gray, can you put these in the chat as I'm saying these things? And then you go down to this button here. It says the Tree Troopers Only page, if everybody sees that. If you click that, it's going to ask you for a password. And that password is the word replant with a capital R and the first, or the only E, I guess. Replant only has one E. It's been a very long day, folks. So the E in replant is going to be the number 3. Plant is going to be all lowercase. And then it's going to be capital A, C, as in Anne Arundel County. So capital R, the number 3, lowercase PLANT, uppercase A, uppercase C. So once you have that, it should let you in. I just want to signpost to folks that this is a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of stuff. This is all the stuff from our first round of Tree Trooper trainings and some supplemental material that happened last year. You can look at that, but where your stuff is going to live is actually right here at the top. It says 2020 Tree Trooper Training. So if you click that button, it'll take you to another page here, and you can see that we have session 1 here. This is where the session presentation recording and the PDF will live eventually, hopefully in the next little bit. But what I want to signpost here, what I would like everybody to do in the next day or so is if you can go in here and do your session assessment. That's going to let us know how we did, what you've learned, what you might need some more help on, and get us some feedback. That's really important. Does anybody have any questions about the website?
So Josh, you said it was go to the WSA site, go under programs, select replant, was it?
Replant Anne Arundel. Yep. Let me just,
Okay.
I'll rewind here. So if you go back to the main page under programs.
Yep.
Replant Anne Arundel.
Yep.
You go towards the bottom on the right hand side, there's a button that says Tree Trooper Program. If you click that, you'll land pretty much, go down to the blue button that says Tree Troopers Only page. You can bypass that and just put into your web bar aawsa.org / replant Anne Arundel as one word, and you'll land right there for the kind of entrance into the Tree Trooper page.
Okay.
Yeah, and I also put this in the chat, but you can go directly to the Tree Troopers Only page by going to awsa.org / Tree Troopers Only. I also put the password in the chat as well, and we will be sending a follow-up email in the next couple of days that will have this information. So don't stress if the the chat is gone and then you're like, oh no, where did it go? We'll make sure that you have access to it. And at any point, if you have more questions, you can email Josh and I. We're here. We're happy to have answers.
Well, starting tomorrow, you're supposed to be on vacation, aren't you?
That's exactly what I was going to say, Lynn. I'm glad you brought that up. So just a signpost to everybody here tonight. This is Gray's and I's last thing to do before spring break. So WSA offices will be closed tomorrow, Friday, and Monday. So we'll be back on Tuesday. But with that in mind, our next session will be a week from tonight, starting at 6. We'll be back with Craig and Brittany, and it'll be another good one. So if anyone doesn't have any other questions, I think that's all we have for this evening.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we had the PDF to be able to print out that last slide, which was the diagram we're going to be looking for tomorrow, or comparing real twigs to tomorrow.
Yep.
And if I see either one of you on a beach in Fort Lauderdale, you're in big trouble. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Have a great night.